So I've given the title to this talk, I've nicked a line from a poem. So the talk is called The Tender Gravity of Kindness, and it's a poem by a woman called Naomi Shihab Nye. And in it she says, before you know kindness as the deepest thing, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. And when I heard the title of the festival, it's a fire in the heart, there's a kind of lot, it's quite a strong image, isn't it? And I thought to myself, well, it's not always like that, practicing metta. The end result might be a fire in the heart. But I think also somewhere you need to get to know the darkness in the heart as well. Or maybe, to use the metaphor a bit more, you need to know what the fuel is that's driving the fire in the heart. And the fuel is often of the earth and often from the underground. So I wanted to just use this talk this afternoon to explore the connection between love and depth and death, because it's just an important connection for me personally. And I also wanted to talk a bit more just about my experience of practicing metta. There's a description of how to practice metta in the form of the metta bhavana meditation, which is a bit like a sort of map, I guess. And then there's this sort of description of the boundless states of love that may be the end result. And somewhere we need to fill in the actual experience of the journey. And when Lokabandhu gave his opening talk the other day, he was talking about how we're in a very, very special time for Buddhism, where it's leapt across the oceans from the east to the west in a very short space of time. And we're still working out what Buddhism means in the West, how it expresses itself in the West. And I find myself very interested in that area. So that's partly the reason why I want to theme this talk around an ancient Greek myth. So this is me sort of just trying to get East and West together a bit. So I want to talk about Persephone. It's my myth. So Persephone's descent into the underworld. It's only a very wee picture, but I've got a very wee picture of Persephone. Yeah, she's quite a dark beauty. So she's, if you're not familiar with Persephone, she's the daughter of Demeter. And Demeter is the earth goddess. The Romans called her Ceres, and out of that we get the word cereal. So she's the goddess of harvests, abundance, fruit, the earth. So she has her daughter Persephone, who she loves dearly. And Persephone is very beautiful. And one day she's out playing with friends in the meadows, in the flowers. Maybe it's a bit like a Buddhafield Festival. But what's happened is that someone's seen her. Hades, the lord of the underworld, the lord of death, has seen Persephone and he's fallen in love with her. And so when she's out this one day, the earth opens beneath her feet and she falls or is dragged down into the underworld. And there she becomes Hades' wife. She becomes queen of the underworld. But her mother is, her mother's distraught. Her mother's distraught to have lost her daughter. She doesn't know where she's gone. She searches everywhere for her. And in her grief, she causes all the things on the earth, they all start to die. There's a famine, there's a drought, and there's a lot of death. And in the end, Zeus, who's chief among gods, has to intervene. And he sends the messenger of the gods, Hermes, I hope you're following all of this, down into the underworld to get Persephone back. And there's a bit of negotiation goes on. Because Persephone has eaten a fruit of the underworld. She's eaten some pomegranate seeds, and that means that she belongs to the underworld. She needs to stay there. So it's not straightforward. She can't just come back to the surface, to the world. So in the end, the arrangement is that she spends the same number of months as she's eaten pomegranate seeds down in the underworld, and the rest of the year she can come up to the surface, into the world of light, into the world of her mother. So on one level that story is just an explanation of the seasons, yeah. But I'd like to take a different angle on it. So I want to talk about superficiality and depth, because this myth is one of a descent. Persephone goes down into the depths, into the realm of the dead. But she begins on the surface. She begins, let's say, in a place of superficiality. And then someone just arriving in our society might be forgiven that what matters most is possessions. So the material world that we can possess, yeah? And we seem to be quite obsessed with that, with money, possessions. We believe that's where happiness comes. It's what advertising sells us. It's the happy person who has that crucial thing that they really need. And Demeter, as the earth goddess, is a goddess of the material world, and we are her children as well. But I think if we don't relate to her with depth, or allow her to have depth, then she's only about matter and not about what matters. And we just stay enchanted with the gloss of the superficial, celebrity culture, skin-deep beauty, cosmetic tricks, quick fixes, instant weight loss, fast food, and speed dating. And we stick to the surface by staying overstimulated, speedy, and somewhat disembodied. So Persephone is on the surface as well. It's a bit like, as Madonna put it, she's living in a material world, and she's a material girl. And maybe we're in that position too, to some extent. And it's unsatisfactory for us, because we're hungry for something and we're not getting it. And it's interesting how much we've got in this society. And yet so many people get stressed and anxious and paradoxically depressed. And at the same time we damage the earth goddess as well. So I just want to look at why we stay on the surface. Well, you might have to conclude it has something to do with fear. We seem to be very afraid of something, running scared of something. So James Hillman, who's a depth psychologist, says to make life matter or count or have a sense of meaning, then the quality of depth has to replace physical significance or physical matter. Yeah? And nothing matters more than death. But we're a death-denying culture. We don't like to talk about death. We don't like to see death. We don't like to age. We always want to look youthful. But I think if we're scared of death, then at the same time we're deprived of depth and significance and meaning, which I think is what we long for. It's what we're hungry for. In a way, depth and meaning is what makes everything worthwhile and bearable to us. So somehow we need to move from the surface into the depths. Persephone seems not to choose to start her journey. It seems more like it's done to her and against her will. But myths don't quite work like that. She's the aspect of us maybe that likes to stay on the surface, but there is something else maybe lurking that is happy with the depths, that wants to go downwards. So she's a bit, there's an ambivalence. There's she's both repelled and attracted. There's a sort of duplicity of fear and desire. And we may feel the same. And I think invariably moving into the depths takes some sort of dissatisfaction with our life. So Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, so before he was enlightened, he lived, we're told, the myth is he lived a very rich and wealthy life as a prince, son of a king. And he left home precisely because his materially rich life, high status, he just found it meaningless in the face of old age, sickness and death. I didn't quite have that upbringing, but I remember when I was younger, I felt disquieted by the privileged nature of my life in relation to the rest of the world. A sense of what will you do with this life to make it meaningful. But also, on my own part, in terms of superficiality, I don't know whether other people are like this, but I found it almost impossible to stay with my experience. I was always ahead of myself, so whatever I was doing, I wasn't really experiencing it or enjoying it because I was thinking about the next thing. And when I did the next thing, it was exactly the same. So I was sort of skating along the surface in my life, which was quite nice. The life was quite nice, but my experience wasn't quite nice because I couldn't really enjoy anything. So there was a dissatisfaction there for me. But I suppose what brought a need to go deeper home to me most clearly was my first solitary retreat. So you go off and you meditate on your own, and it was a week for me, and felt like quite a big step. And I went to Cornwall, and it was about this time of year, and it was pretty much like this. It was a heat wave. It was gorgeous. I was in a little caravan amidst gorse bushes, so everything was blazing with yellow, and gorse flowers smell of coconuts. The air smelt fragrant with coconut. The sky was blue. The sun was shining. Little dogs and small children running on the beach, and everybody was happy, and I was really struggling. I found the whole thing completely, utterly painful. And on the penultimate day, my mood lifted slightly. And at that point, it occurred to me that I really needed to do something about this. It was so obvious that because the surroundings were gorgeous, I couldn't blame anything. It must be my mind. It must be me. It must be my mind. And that I would stay like this for the rest of my life if I don't do something with my mind. And there's the very first part of the Dharma Parlour. In a way, made a lot of sense to me. I don't have a particularly good translation here, but so I'll just read it out. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. So that really made a lot of sense to me, and I thought, well, whatever I'm doing with my mind, it's not working right now. And it goes on to say that if you speak or act with an impure mind, suffering follows. And if you speak or act with a pure mind, then joy follows, like your shadow, like your shadow. So that was my point where I decided I needed to deepen in some sort of way. And what I thought I needed to do, what I decided I needed to do, was do the Metta Bhavana every day for a year. I thought that might be a good starting point. So this is developing loving kindness. A meditation practice involves developing loving kindness. So I want to talk about the path of love, and I want to talk about it in terms of this going into depth, this moving downwards. So the theme of this retreat is is a fire in the heart, and the practices underneath, behind that title is hinting at are the Brahma Viharas. So they're all based on loving kindness. And the Brahma Vihara means sublime abode, so it's sort of like the dwelling of the gods. So there's a sense of rising up, being godlike, being expansive. But I'm interested in what it's like for Western psyches to practice these practices. Psyches that may be running scared of death. Psyches that may be living in a superficial material world. So the first thing I could say is love is, you could think of love as a movement towards. So if you want to move towards anything, you need to have love. So you need to be willing to, you need to have some sort of love for depth in order to go there, I suppose. There's a little paradox there somehow. A bit of you needs to feel love for the depth. But any sort of turning towards experience is an act of love. So meditation is an act of love. All spiritual practice is an act of love. It doesn't necessarily bring you all the time expansive, warm feelings. But in the end, it's what matters. It's what matters most. It's what gives life meaning. So one of the first things that happened to me when I started meditating was not a cultivation of love, but a huge amount of anger that came up. And what I'd done is I just finished a relationship where I was quite young and I was very unconfident, and the person I was in a relationship was quite confident. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, and they always did know what they wanted to do, and I just wanted to be with them. So I always did what they wanted to do. And this had finished, but when I started meditating, I just got a huge amount of anger coming up, which was a bit of a shock, actually. It wasn't what I'd bargained for, but in a way, it was simply I had not had a space to look a particular pattern that I got myself into, and I was furious. I kind of felt I was furious with this guy, but actually I was furious with myself. I was furious with myself for kind of just letting myself down like that, not being true to myself. So something can happen in meditation is you get these really strong emotions that are to do with upset about the past, either about how you've been or maybe about how someone's been to you. There's quite a learning process that can go on there. So I noticed on a retreat, intensive meditation retreat a few years back on the Brahma Viharas, there's a certain point halfway in the retreat where things usually get a bit tricky. And quite a few women on this retreat, it was a women's retreat, were just experiencing a lot of upset and pain. And it always seemed to be in relation to the past. Yeah, it was in relation quite often to their unskillful behaviour in the past that was coming up for them, and it was like that was what needed to be addressed before they could go any further. And I guess all of us just leave things we don't know what to deal with, things that are uncomfortable, things that we don't have the capacity to hold. We just kind of stuff them down, and they're just under the surface, and they need a bit of space to come up. But if we give them that space, then we can learn. And then if you learn, you don't necessarily make those same mistakes again. In a way, it's also practice of ethics. It's a start of the practice of noticing what you habitually do that's unhelpful, that harms either yourself or others, and starting to change it. And maybe all of the issues are usually to do with relationships with others, love and the abuses of love. So love's both taking us deeper, and also it's causing us to look at all the difficulties we get into in connection with others to do with love. We all have our wounds. So there's a process of purification that goes on with the practice of meditation, with the practice of metta, where you start needing to look at some of these things. And metta is also I think of it as a very provocative practice. On a certain level, all it's asking you to do is cultivate well-wishing and kindness towards other people. That seems straightforward. But what's provocative about it is when you can't. When you try and do that and you find the opposite happens. So when you try and put your friend in your meditation practice and wish them well, and you find out that you're really fed up with them, yeah? Or you just can't even deal with your difficult person at all. So it's provocative in the sense that we have to actually start looking at what we're like and not what we hope we're like. And also I think we start having to see that what we're like changes the whole time. We can't fix ourselves, so it starts to undermine this fixed self-view. And I suspect we're always both much better and much worse than we think we are. So another aspect, another issue that came up for me in this, actually it didn't end up being a year practicing metta bhavana, it ended up being, I don't know, 2 or 3, I can't remember now. I just needed to do quite a lot. Was that I'm very disciplined, so I could just get on and do it. But I was just struggling with it. I just found it really difficult practice to do. And after, I don't know, a year or so, when I was sitting down to meditation, I was thinking, oh God, I hate this meditation. But I'll do it anyway. I just heard this little voice going, when will you ever be good enough? When will you ever be good enough? And I realised that what I was doing was I was trying to cultivate love because I believed I wasn't good enough. So the very practice, which was about being kind to yourself, I was beating myself up. I was doing, the motivation for doing it was because I wasn't good enough, if that makes sense. There's a guy called Robert Priest who uses the term spiritual pathology, which I quite like, to refer to the way in which our emotional wounds and beliefs have the power to influence and shape and distort the way we practice and how we view the spiritual path. And he says that we're usually blind to this distortion because the very wounds that inform it we're unconscious of. So in my case, if I want to call it a wound, I could say that I didn't believe I was good enough. And I couldn't really get any further with my practice of metta until I'd addressed that issue that I was doing it because I didn't believe I was good enough. And I suspect this isn't uncommon. I suspect this is something quite a lot of us hit up against. I think we probably find it very hard to love ourselves. We probably have to work with quite, maybe culturally, just a large amount of self-loathing and low self-esteem that I know teachers from the East have just been quite surprised by and not known how to deal with. It's just not something that they're used to in the East. So I just want to talk about original sin at this point. Get a bit of original sin in. So I don't know whether I quite got this right, but I was reading something that's talking about St. Augustine the other month. And how they put it, I hadn't kind of understood this, but was that from a Christian point of view, if we're made in the image of God, but we die, the fact that we die means that there's something wrong or bad or impure about us. And that is the sort of original, in there is the whole concept of original sin, that there's something fundamentally wrong with us. And we might not believe in God, and we might think original sin's a completely stupid, unhelpful idea. but it's very, very embedded in our culture. So the need to be faster, richer, more beautiful, more dynamic, slimmer, you could say they're all manifestations of this. Yeah? The sense that you're just not good enough as you are. And we can, as I mentioned before, we can start practicing the spiritual path precisely because we're not good enough. So actually how we engage with spiritual practice can be completely informed by that. So I just want to talk about, so what's the Buddhist perspective? And there's this lovely figure, I've got a little starting of a shrine here. There's this lovely figure called Vajrasattva who represents original purity. So it's the complete opposite. So Vajrasattva represents our potential. And he's quite a lofty figure. He represents the mind that has transcended the limits of space and time. But when you emerge beyond those limits, you find that you are enlightened. And beyond time, you always have been. It's your essential nature. You're a diamond being. So that's the viewpoint of Buddhism. She's totally different from original sin. It's the complete opposite way around. So it's very radical for us, I think. So I think Vajrasattva is quite an important figure for us. He's certainly been an important figure for me. So from a Buddhist point of view, our bad habits and difficult mental states are more to do with, they're more adventitious, they're on the surface. They're what covers things over, the goodness in us over. So they're superficial. Go back to surface and depth again. So we're flipping around surface and depth. So you've got the Christian on the surface, you might behave yourself, but deep down you're terrible. And Buddhist perspective, on the surface you might be a bit irritable sometimes, a bit grumpy, a bit greedy, but underneath you're fundamentally good. So there's another image. I didn't have rags. Just put this down. So the other image, this was the best I could do. If you just imagine that's muddy rags, is that we are like just a bundle of muddy rags, and inside is a jewel. Inside is a jewel. So that's the way you relate to your negative aspects, yeah? There's a jewel inside. So somehow I had to figure out how to do practice, how to meditate, whilst not assuming fundamental badness at the same time. That's still work in progress. And I think it would be fair to say that until we come into a loving relationship with ourselves, it's very hard to see how we can truly love other people. So the first stage of the metta practice is always about us. It's always about our relationship with ourselves and kindness and love towards ourselves. So these were three things that I hit upon practicing metta, and the last one was failure. Call it failure. So I suppose it's easy to think that you want to get somewhere, where you want to succeed, you want to get to an end point where you can just stop and you're fine. And I think practicing metta bhavana, well, practicing anything in the spiritual life, is you never get to the end. You never do get to the end. So somehow you have to change your relationship with the end, and the process becomes what's important. You can never love enough, for example. And in some ways you just have to come into a relationship with actually what you're doing right now needs to be sufficient somehow. There's a poem, I'll misquote a poem. Anyway, it's more the image I was interested in, about someone writing about their mother had just died, and in the poem they wrote, "My father ran round the garden shouting, 'She's dead, and I could have done more for her.'" And then the poem goes on to say that the mother, just before she died, said, "He was the best man in the world. He couldn't have done more for me." I thought that was rather lovely. And there's something about, in a way, we can never do enough. You can never do enough for your children, you can never do enough for your parents, you can never do enough for your friends. But somehow that needs to be enough. And I live in a community with other Buddhist women, and this sense of failure has certainly been quite something for me, living in community, because I always feel like I fail there. I think there's just a need to, you just have to keep trying again. So you keep hitting problems with someone and then you just try again. Pick yourself up, and you need a sense of lightness and a sense of humour maybe. And I think we also need a sense of, when we're working with our hearts, that it's a slow process and it can't be forced. You can't will your heart to open or change or radiate fire. The heart doesn't really work like that. The heart works slowly, and I think it works with images. So someone said that the Chinese, I'm not sure I pronounce it, Chinese ideogram of forbearance is a sword hanging over the heart, which is quite an interesting image. And what they were bringing out of that is that the heart, in a way, is always vulnerable. It's always just there. It can be hurt at any moment. So in a way, and maybe it always has its wounds, doesn't it? Maybe the nature of the heart's to be somewhat wounded, somewhat hurt. And we're always working with that. That's actually what we're working with, is this rather tender, vulnerable heart. And that takes time. So for me, I'm describing those things because they're all a sense of descent. They're all, none of them seem to be about generating huge amounts of radiant love, and all of them seem to be about encountering difficulties that needed to be resolved in some way, or things that meant I needed to fundamentally change my view about who I am and what I'm capable of. So we fail and we fall, and love pulls us downwards through those things. But as well as that fear and that falling and the failing, I think at some point we also find our realm, we find our kingdom. So Persephone falls, and then she finds that she's queen of the underworld. She's quite something. Hades may be the lord of death, but he's also has incomparable wisdom, interestingly enough. I think he has the intelligence of love and death, and she's beloved of that wisdom. And I think that the Buddha, in some ways, I think of him as a bit of a lord of death, in the sense that he understood death. He understood that staying on the surface, the material possessions, the status, the wealth, was not satisfactory, was not sufficient in the face of old age, sickness and death. But he also, when he tried extreme asceticism, he also realised that trying to overcome our weaknesses, to rise above the body, to separate off from the body, also didn't work. He described that as ignoble in the end. He did try pretty hard. But in the end, he comes into a relationship with just how things are, with death, with impermanence, with the fact that everything is in constant flux and change. Even things don't exist in their own right. They're simply processes, conditions which arise in dependence on other conditions. And when those conditions change or cease, which they must, then the things depend on them also cease. And that's what we are And that is what the world is. And we are not separate or different from the world. The world is just everything that is arising in this moment. And when you see that, that's when the heart really starts to open. So the emotional aspect to that seeing is compassion. A tremendous compassion arises, perhaps just for the fragile evanescence and transience of life. So Persephone has become queen of the underworld. She's come into connection with depth and death and wisdom, and there's love there. But she's wanted back on the surface. But she's eaten pomegranate seeds. She's eaten from the underworld. I had to bring a pomegranate with me, just because I had to. Just because I have to remind you what pomegranates look like. So they're just full of seeds. They're a symbol of richness, abundance, fertility. So she's been nourished. It's quite interesting. She's been nourished in the underworld. Nourished by the richness of the underworld. And the Romans also called Hades Pluto, and Pluto was the god of riches and wealth, interestingly enough. When where you're nourished, there you belong. So it's not straightforward. If she's being nourished there, if we're being nourished by our depths, we need to stay there to some extent. So Persephone is beloved of Hades, she's beloved of Demeter, she's beloved of the underworld, she's beloved of the material world, she's doubly beloved and doubly abundant. But there's a conflict, isn't there? She's wanted in both places. So I think in terms of our spiritual practice, so just to keep going with metaphor, we can deepen, we can fall and we can deepen into love and wisdom. But this isn't just about our interior world and our experience. The love and the wisdom also need to be brought to the surface. They need to be manifesting in the world. They need to be manifesting in the material world because they matter and because the world is dying and suffering because of the lack of them. So we come to this very interesting figure in the myth, Hermes, the messenger of the gods, the friendliest of the gods. He's a traveller, he's a god of merchants and thieves. He's the only god who can go into the underworld. He has the quality to move between worlds, to steal across boundaries and borders, and to take things from one world to another. So he's a translator as well. So there's some quality that he has that we need when we come into the fruits of our practice. We need to move him out into the world, and there's some quality that he represents that we need to have in us. When the Buddha gained enlightenment, he was thinking how difficult it would be to teach anybody and how much easier it would simply be just to sit there and enjoy his experience of the nature of reality. And this God turns up, Brahma Sahampati, who says, no, please, there are some people who will understand. Please teach for the welfare of the world. So the Buddha has this similar, he has his other figure, Brahma Sahampati, but he then goes out into the world. He spends the rest of his life walking northern India and teaching. So I find Hermes a very interesting figure of how to, there's something about how to move between the material world and the world of depth. The world of a soul, you could say. And I suspect that there are times in our lives when we're going deeper, and there are times in our lives when we're bringing it up to the surface and bringing it out. And I think of it as it needs to come out almost through our fingertips. And for me, the context in which I practice and meditate becomes really important at this point. So we need a community, we need a context in which we can express our practice, in which we can learn to bring things out. So I've been working at in a Buddhist business for the last 19 years, wind horse evolution. And actually for me that's been a really good container where I've got people who are at least sympathetic, trying to do something similar, to hold my attempts at practicing, and also to encourage me, and also to exemplify how to do it. Because not everybody wants us to manifest change. Some people really just want us to be how we are, and that can be painful. Okay, so just to wrap up, so I've told you a story about falling in a state of love into the depths, becoming a queen in the underworld, and then this process of coming back up into the world, but it's constantly changing. She's going up and then she's coming down again. And I just want to come back to the title of the talk, which was A Tender Gravity of Kindness, which I quite liked. In a way, it sort of sums that up, doesn't it? It's so you have the kindness, the gravity of kindness that pulls you down into the earth. And you also have the grave in gravity. And then also you need to take that depth and bring it out into the world. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish. I'll just read the poem because it's a rather lovely poem, and then I'll finish. So the poem is called Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in the white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you have been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. Thank you.